Yarden Ellis shoved his shoulder into the stubborn front door of apartment 1B, balancing a half-torn paper grocery bag in his other hand, and trying not to drop the box of cereal his 6-year-old son insisted they couldn't live without. "Dad, it's falling," Felix called out from behind him, his little arms full with a bag of oranges and a loaf of bread that looked like it had already lost the battle. "I got it, buddy," Yarden huffed, finally getting the door to swing open with a loud creak. "Welcome to Castle Ellis. Watch your step and don't trip over the kingdom of unmatched socks." Felix giggled, dropping the groceries on the tiny kitchen table. Their apartment was small, dimly lit, and filled with the kind of mismatched furniture you only get from garage sales and good neighbors. Still, it was home. "Hey, Dad," Felix asked, peeking out the front window. "Someone's moving in upstairs." Yarden followed his son's gaze to the dusty stairwell outside. A moving truck was parked at the curb, and a woman in a navy pantsuit was directing 2 movers who were clearly terrified of getting a single corner of her white couch scuffed. She didn't look like anyone who belonged in this building. Yarden's brows lifted as she turned and took off her sunglasses. She was beautiful, sharp cheekbones, deep brown eyes, and the kind of presence that made you stand up straighter just watching her. She looked like she had stepped off the set of a perfume commercial and landed in the middle of their creaky, run-down complex. "You think she brought candy?" Felix whispered. Yarden laughed. "She looks more like the briefcase and coffee type." Still, when the movers nearly dropped her marble coffee table on the stairs, Yarden was already heading out the door, Felix trailing behind him. "Need a hand?" he asked, jogging up the steps. The woman turned, surprised. Up close, she looked even more put together. Her dark hair was tied back in a low bun, and even in the heat, she didn't break a sweat. "Oh, thank you. Yes, that was about to end in a lawsuit." Her voice was calm, smooth, but her eyes were scanning the damage. Yarden grabbed the other end of the table and helped guide it into the upstairs apartment. "I'm Yarden. I live downstairs with my son. Welcome to the world's creakiest building." She gave a short laugh. "I'm Paloma." "Paloma Merritt." Felix stepped forward, holding out a squashed orange like it was a trophy. "Do you want one?" Paloma bent down, smiling. "Only if you promise not to tell anyone I almost crushed your dad with furniture." Yarden watched her laugh with his son, and something tugged at his chest. Most people gave Felix a polite smile and moved on, but she crouched, talked to him like he mattered. By the time they finished helping her get the last few boxes inside, the sun was starting to dip. "Thanks again," Paloma said, brushing a strand of hair behind her ear. "I owe you dinner." Yarden raised a brow. "You cook," she hesitated. "I own a phone that calls restaurants." Felix laughed, and Yarden shook his head. "You don't owe me a thing, but if you ever need anything, we're right downstairs. Just knock." Paloma's eyes softened. "That's rare." "What is kindness without an angle?" Yarden just shrugged. "I'm not complicated." She offered a small smile. "Well, I'll try not to stomp around too much. Good luck." "These floors make sounds I didn't know wood could make." That night, after Felix fell asleep, Yarden sat on the edge of his worn couch, staring up at the ceiling and wondering why he couldn't stop thinking about the woman upstairs. She wasn't just beautiful, there was something else. Something he couldn't name. What he didn't know was that Paloma Merritt hadn't moved into this building by accident. She'd walked away from a corner office on the top floor of a glass tower downtown, the youngest CEO in her company's history. She'd left behind a life filled with handshakes, boardrooms, and people who smiled at her only when they wanted something. No one here knew her name. No one cared about her net worth, and for the first time in a long time, she wanted to stay. The next morning, Yarden found a small white bag hanging from his doorknob. Inside, 3 kwasas, a bottle of fresh orange juice, and a note written in neat handwriting. "Thanks for the save. No coffee table injuries today." "Paloma," he smiled. Felix peeked over his shoulder. "She's fancy." Yarden nodded. "Yeah, she really is." Over the next few days, Paloma kept showing up, sometimes with leftovers, sometimes with questions about the building, sometimes just to sit on the stoop with Felix and talk about dinosaurs. Yarden tried not to think too hard about how fast she was becoming part of their life. One evening, after a spaghetti dinner that turned into an accidental food fight, Felix was in bed early, and Yarden found Paloma sitting on the stairs outside with 2 beers in hand. "I figured you could use a break," she said, patting the step next to her. He sat down, taking the bottle. "Not exactly champagne." "Sometimes simple is better," she said softly. They sat in silence for a while, watching the streetlights flicker on. "Why'd you move here?" he asked finally. Paloma hesitated. "I needed a reset. Too many people, too much noise, bad breakup, worse, bad life." Yarden looked over. "You seem like someone who has it all together." "I used to," he nodded slowly. "Well, welcome to the land of broken door handles and cereal for dinner." "We're happy to have you." Paloma turned, her gaze meeting his. "I think I needed to meet someone like you." Yarden's heart jumped. He tried to keep his voice calm. "Someone like me. Someone real." He didn't know what to say to that, but he didn't have to. Because right then, she leaned in and kissed him soft, careful, like she didn't expect anything back. But he kissed her anyway, and it felt like the most honest thing he'd done in years. The next morning, Paloma stood in front of her bathroom mirror, applying mascara with the kind of careful precision that had once been her armor in boardrooms. But today, it wasn't about strategy or presentation. It was about seeing Yarden again, and that realization made her pause. She put the mascara down and stared at her reflection. Her hair was still damp from the shower, curling slightly at the ends. No blazer, no heels, just a cotton top and jeans. She looked like herself. Or at least the version she used to be before the job ate everything soft about her. Downstairs, she heard the familiar clatter of something hitting tile. Followed by Felix's laughter, she smiled. When she knocked on Yarden's door, it swung open before she could drop her hand again. He looked tired, one sleeve of his t-shirt soaked with what looked like milk. "Morning," she said, holding up a paper bag. "I brought muffins and napkins." "You're a saint," he said, stepping aside to let her in. The apartment smelled faintly of burnt toast and cinnamon. Felix was on the floor, building something elaborate with plastic blocks, his face smeared with jelly. "Paloma," he jumped up and ran over. "I made a spaceship that turns into a dragon." "Of course you did," she said, crouching next to him. "Does it breathe fire or shoot lasers?" "Both." Yarden opened the bag and took out a blueberry muffin. "You're never this bright-eyed this early." "What's your secret?" "Not having to answer 40 emails before 8 a.m., she said, sitting on the arm of the couch. He looked at her then, really looked. "You don't talk about your old job much." "There's not a lot worth saying," she replied, unwrapping a muffin. "I gave it everything. It took everything. I left before there was nothing left of me." "You don't miss it?" he asked, leaning against the counter. "I miss having a driver," she said dryly, "and not having to think twice before buying groceries. But no, I don't miss what it turned me into." Felix launched into an explanation of the spaceship's self-destruct system, giving them both a moment to breathe. When he was done, Paloma turned to Yarden. "What about you? What did you do before the world got complicated?" "Construction," he said. "Mostly residential. I worked for a company that went under after the housing crash. I took a few gigs here and there, but after Felix's mom left, I needed something steadier. So now I do maintenance for 3 buildings in the neighborhood. That's a lot to juggle." "Yeah. But it keeps the lights on." Paloma fell quiet. Her fingers picked at the edge of the muffin wrapper. Yarden glanced over. "You okay?" "I'm just realizing how little I know about normal life," she said. "Your life is 10 times harder than mine ever was, but you still have space for kindness." "That's rare." "Kindness isn't a luxury," he said. "It's a choice." She looked at him then, and something in her chest squeezed tight. Later that afternoon, while Felix was at a friend's birthday party down the block, Yarden offered Paloma his arm and said, "Want to see the real gem of the neighborhood?" She raised a brow. "Is it another vending machine that only takes quarters from the 70s? Better," he grinned. "There's a park 3 blocks over. No tourists, just cracked benches and a tree that's been struck by lightning twice." She followed him through the winding back streets, past corner stores and rows of houses with laundry fluttering from windows. The park was small, tucked between 2 brick buildings with graffiti on their sides. But it was quiet, peaceful. There was a tire swing hanging from a thick branch and a patch of grass that looked like it had seen every game of tag in the world. They sat on the bench closest to the tree. Paloma leaned back and closed her eyes. "This is perfect. You're hard to impress," he teased. I spent the last 6 years at rooftop bars and restaurants where menus didn't include prices, she said. This feels like air. He looked at her sideways. You're not what I expected. She opened one eye. What did you expect? I don't know. You look like someone who wouldn't make eye contact with a guy like me, but then you bring muffins and talk to my kid like he's not just background noise. That's a low bar, she said. More people trip over it than you'd think. Paloma turned to him. You're a good father. His jaw tightened slightly. I try. That's more than most do, she said quietly. They sat there, the breeze tugging at her hair, the sound of a basketball bouncing faintly in the distance. Finally, she asked, do you ever think about starting over? Yarden didn't answer right away. I used to, he said. But then I realized, I can't go back and fix anything. I just try not to mess up the next thing. That's the best I can do. She nodded slowly. That's fair. When they returned, Felix was already home, sitting on the couch with a paper crown on his head and icing on his nose. Paloma laughed. Did you take the throne while we were gone? I'm King Felix now, he declared. I command more cake. Yarden ruffled his hair. Only if you brush your teeth twice tonight. Paloma leaned against the doorframe, watching them. She hadn't planned on staying long when she moved in. A few weeks, maybe a month. Just enough time to remember who she was before she chased titles and traded sleep for spreadsheets. But now she wasn't so sure she wanted to leave at all. That night, as she stood in front of her bedroom window, watching the glow of the city in the distance, she realized something terrifying. She wasn't just falling for a life she didn't understand. She was falling for someone who didn't know who she really was. Paloma stood in the tiny kitchen of her apartment, staring at the open cabinet. There was a half-used bag of rice, a can of black beans, and a jar of peanut butter with the label half peeled. She exhaled through her nose, grabbed the rice, and started boiling water. She hadn't intended to stay long enough to need groceries. But staying was no longer a question. The knock at her door startled her. When she opened it, Yarden stood there, his hands stuffed in the pockets of his hoodie, a folded piece of paper in one fist. I need a favor, he said. She stepped aside wordlessly and he walked in, holding out the paper. It's from Felix's school. They're doing this father-son project thing. Some kind of science fair, but they want volunteers to help prep the space. I said yes, but they're short on hands. She took the paper and scanned it. You want me to help? You don't have to, he said quickly. I just figured you're organized and you've got that. Efficient energy, she laughed softly. Efficient energy. You know, you make lists in your head before you walk into a room. All right, she said, putting the paper on the counter. When? Tomorrow afternoon. I'll pick up Felix after school and meet you there. She nodded. I'll be there. The next day, the elementary school gym buzzed with the chaos of half-finished posters, cardboard dioramas, and the unmistakable smell of glue sticks and juice boxes. Yarden arrived with Felix, who ran off to join a group of kids gathered around a table covered in sparkly pipe cleaners. Paloma rolled up her sleeves and got to work taping down cords, setting up tables, and helping a flustered PTA mother find extra scissors. You weren't kidding, Yarden said, coming up beside her with a roll of masking tape. You're frighteningly efficient. She handed him a stack of name tags. I'll take frightening over useless any day. One of the teachers passed by, distractedly calling out something about the projector not working. Yarden looked at Paloma. You any good with tech? She arched a brow. I once rebooted an entire system with a paperclip and a broken stylus. He blinked. That sounds fake. It wasn't. I was on a conference call in Dubai at the time. He stared at her. You've been to Dubai, she hesitated, realizing too late that she'd said too much. I traveled a lot for work, she said quickly. Past life. He nodded slowly but didn't press. After the setup, while Felix showed off his solar system model with glowing pride, Paloma wandered to a quiet corner of the gym, watching as Yarden knelt beside his son, asking questions and listening like every word mattered. A few minutes later, he joined her near the bleachers. You okay? She nodded. It's just strange. I used to sit in rooms with people who couldn't go 30 seconds without checking their phones. And now I'm here, watching a kid explain how Pluto's not a planet anymore like it's breaking news. Yarden leaned against the wall beside her. You look more at home here than you think, she looked up at him. Do I? Yeah, you're not trying so hard, you're just being. That night, back at her apartment, Paloma sat on the floor with her laptop open. The screen glowed with an email from her former assistant, subject line: Final Opportunity Board Reconsideration. She read the first sentence 3 times. The board wants to offer you the interim CEO title again. They're willing to renegotiate your exit if you'll take over by the end of the quarter. She stared at the blinking cursor. She could go back. The salary would erase every financial worry she'd ignored for weeks. The perks, the prestige, the control, it was all waiting, but she didn't click reply. Instead, she closed the laptop and went downstairs. Yarden opened the door in sweatpants and bare feet, rubbing the back of his neck. Hey, he said, everything okay? I didn't come to talk, she said. Can I sit with you? He stepped aside without a word. They sat on the couch, silence stretching between them, not heavy but full. Finally, he asked, did something happen? She looked at him. I was offered my old life back, the whole thing, position, salary, everything. His expression didn't change, and I haven't answered, he nodded slowly. Do you want to? I don't know, she said. I thought I would, that's what I came here for, to regroup, to reset, but now. She trailed off. Yarden leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. You don't need my opinion. But for what it's worth, I think you already know what your answer is. She looked at him. What if I make the wrong choice? That's part of it, he said. You make one, you live it. He turned his head slightly toward her. But whichever life you choose, I hope it's one where you're not looking over your shoulder. She nodded once, then leaned into him, her head against his shoulder. Neither of them moved. Later, after she returned upstairs, she sat alone in the dark with the laptop closed on the table. And she didn't open it again. The next week, she took Felix to the library for their Saturday reading hour. She watched him curl up with a picture book, his face scrunched in concentration. Yarden had a morning shift fixing a busted boiler in another building, but he'd meet them after. Paloma browsed the shelves, letting her fingers drift across the spines, until something caught her eye, a children's book about space. She picked it up and turned a few pages, then smiled. Felix'll love this, Yarden said behind her. She turned, startled. You're early. Boiler was worse than they thought. Called in a backup guy. I figured I'd rather be here. She handed him the book. He's probably already read half of these. Yarden took it, flipping through. Maybe, but he likes hearing them from you. Paloma met his eyes. He's a good kid. He is, Yarden said, and he likes you a lot. Her breath caught slightly. I like him too. Yarden paused, and me. She didn't hesitate. You most of all. He stepped closer. Then stay. She blinked. What? Forget the offer, forget the boardroom, stay here. With us, Paloma looked up at him. That life has a lot to offer. So does this one, he said, but only if you want it, she swallowed. I do, and she meant it. Rain came in sheets that morning, slapping against the windows of Paloma's apartment with the kind of insistence that made the city feel smaller, quieter. She stood barefoot in the kitchen, watching the gray blur beyond the glass while the kettle whistled behind her. She had made her decision 2 nights ago, but she hadn't said it out loud yet. Not to herself, not to Yarden, not even in the silence of her own thoughts. But it lived in her bones now, humming under her skin like a second heartbeat. Downstairs, she heard the faint thump of footsteps and then a knock at her door. When she opened it, Yarden stood there with a dripping umbrella and a crooked grin. Felix was at school, and she knew immediately this visit wasn't about errands or reminders. You busy? He asked. She stepped aside. Only if you're here to borrow sugar. I'm fresh out. He set the umbrella by the door and shook out his jacket. I was thinking we could go somewhere. She raised an eyebrow. It's pouring. That's the point, he said. Come on. Trust me? 10 minutes later, they were in his truck, windshield wipers squealing with every pass. He drove without telling her where they were going, and she didn't ask. They ended up at a hill just outside the city, one she hadn't seen before. The rain had softened to a drizzle. Beyond the trees, the skyline stretched in the distance, softened by mist and cloud. How'd you find this place? She asked, stepping carefully over the wet ground. Years ago, he said. I brought Felix here once when he had a fever that wouldn't break. We sat in the truck, and he watched the lights until he fell asleep. Paloma folded her arms, the air damp around them. Why bring me now? Yarden leaned against the hood. Because this is where I go when I need to be sure of something. She turned to him. I've never had a lot to offer, he said. Not in terms of money or status, but I've built a life I'm proud of. It's messy and it's loud, and sometimes it's barely holding together, but it's mine. She stepped closer. And I want you in it, he continued, not just for a few weeks. Not until you get tired of cracked floors and cereal dinners. For good. Paloma's hands were cold, but her heart was steady. She didn't hesitate. I said no to the job, she told him. I deleted the email, shut the door on that version of me. I'm not that person anymore. He looked at her, quiet for a moment. Are you sure? Yes, she said, because for the first time in years I woke up and didn't feel like I had to earn my place in the world. You and Felix, you gave me that without asking for anything in return. The wind picked up, pulling at her jacket. She laughed softly and added, and because I think I love you. Yarden didn't say anything right away. He just stepped forward and kissed her, slow and certain, like he was sealing a promise they'd both already made. When he pulled back, his eyes were wet not from the rain. I love you too, he said. And Felix already told me he's saving you a spot on the couch for movie nights. They stayed there until the clouds began to break. By the time they returned, the city was drying, the sidewalks warm again beneath their feet. Weeks passed. Paloma didn't move back upstairs. She didn't need to. They rearranged the furniture, cleared a space in the closet, and turned a corner of the living room into a reading nook that Felix claimed as his kingdom. On weekends, she taught him how to make pancakes without burning the edges, while Yarden fixed leaky sinks in the building 2 blocks over. One afternoon, she picked up a call from an unknown number. It was a reporter from a business magazine, asking if she was ready to return to the public eye. I'm not available, she said gently. I'm right where I need to be. She hung up and smiled. 3 months later, they stood in a modest garden behind the community center, surrounded by neighbors and the smell of fresh flowers. Felix wore a bow tie too big for his collar and carried the rings with the seriousness of someone delivering state secrets. Paloma wore a dress she found in a consignment store, simple and elegant with no designer label. Yarden took her hands in his, and the look in his eyes made her forget every boardroom she'd ever stood in. When they said their vows, there were no photographers, no headlines. Just a crowd of people who had watched them fall in love through shared dinners and quiet Saturdays. Afterward, they danced beneath string lights that flickered like stars, and Paloma didn't care that her heels sank into the grass. She was home. And not the kind with walls and windows, but the kind built from laughter, from second chances, from the courage to choose love over fear. As the night deepened and Felix fell asleep on a bench with a cupcake still in his hand, Yarden kissed her temple and whispered, "So, Mrs. Ellis." "Still glad you stayed." Paloma looked around the garden, at the life they'd built not with money or titles, but with heart. "I've never been more sure of anything in my life." The first snowfall of winter arrived like a whispered promise, blanketing the city in white. Paloma stood near the window of the apartment she now truly called home, watching delicate flakes tumble past the glass. Behind her, the soft shuffle of socks against hardwood signaled Felix's approach. "Can we build a snow fort?" he asked, already tugging on his sweatshirt. She turned, brushing a hand over his head. "Only if you promise not to declare snowball war on me the second we step outside." He considered that. "No promises." From the bedroom, Yarden's voice called out, muffled and amused. "You're on your own if he turns the yard into a battlefield." "I'll remember that," Paloma replied, grinning. They bundled up Felix in his puffy jacket that made him look like a marshmallow, Paloma in a coat she'd found at a consignment shop with a lining warmer than anything she'd owned before. Yarden met them downstairs, gloved hands holding a thermos he handed off to her. "Hot cocoa," he said. "With those weird marshmallows you pretend not to like." "I never said I didn't like them," Paloma corrected. "I said they're suspiciously shaped." They stepped into the backyard, which had become a shared space over the months, part garden, part playground, part sanctuary. Felix immediately dropped to his knees and began sculpting a wall of snow with intense focus. Paloma leaned into Yarden's side, sipping from the thermos. "He's getting taller. Tell me about it. I had to let the hem out of his school pants last week." Again, "You're doing a good job," she said, her voice low enough that Felix wouldn't hear. Yarden looked down at her. "We are." That evening, after Felix fell asleep sprawled across the couch with a comic book on his chest, Yarden pulled Paloma into the kitchen. She noticed the flicker of nerves in his posture, the way his fingers tapped twice on the counter before he turned to face her fully. "I've been thinking," he said. She crossed her arms, curious, dangerous territory. "I want to buy the building," she blinked. "What?" "I've been saving for years, a little here, a little there. Felix's college fund is separate, I didn't touch that. But the rest I've been looking at the numbers. The current owner's retiring and I know the maintenance better than anyone. I can keep rent affordable, fix what needs fixing. Give people a place they don't have to leave when prices go up." Paloma stared at him, warmth blooming in her chest. "You'd be a landlord." "Not a landlord," he corrected. "A caretaker. Of the people who have become my family." She stepped closer, resting her hands against his chest. "You're going to change lives. I just want to protect the one we've built." Later that week, Paloma found herself rifling through a file box of old paperwork. She pulled out a thick envelope she'd nearly forgotten her final severance package, untouched. She stared at it for a long moment, then added it to the growing stack of documents Yarden needed for the building purchase. "Consider it an investment," she said when he looked at her in surprise. "I can't take your money." "You're not. You're taking our future." That spring, they hosted a block party in the alley between the buildings. Neighbors brought folding chairs and lemonade, kids drew chalk masterpieces on the pavement, and someone's uncle played guitar with surprising skill. Felix ran up to them mid-afternoon, face flushed and hair wild. "Someone said you own the building now," he told Yarden with wide eyes. "I do," Felix nodded thoughtfully. "Does that mean I'm the prince of the building?" Yarden laughed. "Absolutely. But no royal tantrums allowed." Paloma watched them from her folding chair, heart full. The party stretched into the evening. When the sun dipped low, Yarden took Paloma's hand and led her to the rooftop. She hadn't been up there since she'd first moved in. The view was modest, the city horizon in the distance, rooftop gardens below, laundry lines fluttering slightly in the breeze, but it was theirs. "I want to build something up here," Yarden said, squeezing her hand. "A greenhouse, maybe a little reading corner. Something everyone can use." "I'll help," she said. "I know you will." He turned to her, the twilight catching in his eyes. "This life we made, it's not flashy, but it's real and it's ours." She nodded. "I wouldn't trade it for all the penthouses in Manhattan." He leaned in, brushing his lips against hers, the kiss soft and certain. "I have one more question," he murmured. She blinked. "What?" He stepped back and reached into his back pocket, a small box, velvet, worn at the edges. He opened it slowly. Inside, a simple ring. Gold, no stone, no flourish, just elegant and honest. "I never thought I'd ask anyone this," he said. "But then you showed up with muffins and changed everything." She laughed, tears pricking her eyes. "Paloma Merritt, will you marry me again?" This time officially, not just in front of neighbors and cupcakes, but in every way that counts. She didn't hesitate. "Yes," she said, voice cracking with emotion. "In every way that counts." They held each other there, beneath the soft hum of the city and the glow of 1,000 windows. A few months later, they stood in a historic community hall, surrounded by neighbors, friends, and a few family members who had traveled more miles than they'd expected. Felix walked Paloma down the aisle, holding her hand like a gentleman, his tie slightly crooked. Yarden waited at the altar, not in a tuxedo, but in the only suit he owned, the one Paloma had helped him pick out for building negotiations. He looked at her like she was the only person in the room, and in that moment, she felt like she was. Their vows were spoken quietly, but the meaning echoed in every heart watching. Afterward, they danced in the courtyard under hanging lights. Felix cut in halfway through to dance with his mom, his hands on her waist, stepping carefully on her toes. "Are we a real family now?" he asked. Paloma kissed his forehead. "We always were." That night, they returned to their apartment, now more home than any house ever had been. Yarden carried her across the threshold, laughing when she made a face. "This is technically still my apartment." "Not anymore," he said. "It's ours." They curled up on the couch, her head on his chest, rain beginning to patter softly outside. "I used to think love had to be big," she whispered. "Loud, expensive, perfect." Yarden kissed the top of her head. What do you think now? I think love is waking up to find your son tried to make waffles without help and used half a bottle of syrup. I think love is knowing you'd give up everything just to keep this. He tightened his arm around her. You'll never have to give it up. She closed her eyes, listening to the rhythm of his heartbeat, and for the first time in her entire life, she didn't feel like she was waiting for something better. She already had it, forever.